Every day, hundreds of millions of people sit down at their computers and begin working, browsing, communicating, and creating, completely unaware of what is running quietly in the background. Not malware, not a virus, not something installed by accident or by a bad actor. Something built deliberately into the operating system by the company that made it. Something enabled by default. Something that, depending on your perspective and your priorities, is either a genuinely useful feature of modern computing or one of the most significant privacy questions in the history of consumer software. Windows 11 contains features that observe what you do on your computer. They record activity, they generate identifiers that follow your behavior across applications and services, they synchronize data with cloud infrastructure, and they do all of this not in a hidden or illegal way. The documentation exists, the settings exist, the ability to disable these features exists, but in a way that the vast majority of users have never examined, never configured, and never consciously chosen. The question this discussion is going to answer is not simply what these features are. It is whether you understand what you have agreed to, and whether, once you do understand it, you will make a different choice. What is running on your machine right now while you watch this is worth knowing. Windows 11 contains several background systems that collectively define how the operating system observes, records, and transmits information about your computing activity. For the purposes of this examination, we are going to focus on three interconnected components that together represent the most substantive and least understood privacy considerations in the current Windows experience: the advertising ID, the activity history and telemetry system, and the recall feature, Microsoft's AI-powered timeline capability. Understanding each of these requires understanding not just what they do, but why they were built, how they function technically, and what their relationship to Microsoft's broader platform strategy actually is. The advertising ID is perhaps the least dramatic of the three, but in some ways, the most quietly consequential. Every Windows 11 installation generates a unique identifier associated with your device and your user account. This identifier functions similarly to a cookie in a web browser. It allows applications and services to recognize your device across sessions and, in theory, deliver advertising and personalized content that is relevant to your observed behavior and preferences. The advertising ID is used by applications from the Microsoft Store that serve advertisements, by Microsoft's own services and applications, and potentially by third-party applications that integrate with Microsoft's advertising infrastructure. The important technical distinction is that the advertising ID is not, by itself, transmitting a continuous stream of your browsing history to a remote server. What it does is provide a consistent identifier that can be associated with behavioral data collected through various touchpoints, the applications you install, the searches you conduct through Windows Search, the content you engage with through Microsoft services. Over time and across interactions, that consistent identifier enables a profile of your preferences and behaviors that advertisers can use for targeting purposes. The activity history and telemetry system operates at a broader and more technically complex level. Windows 11 continuously collects diagnostic and usage data from your machine and transmits it to Microsoft servers. The scope of this collection is divided into tiers, which Microsoft describes as basic and full in older documentation and as required and optional in more recent documentation. Required diagnostic data includes information about your device, hardware, software configuration, and system performance, the kind of data Microsoft uses to identify and diagnose issues affecting Windows stability across its install base. Optional diagnostic data is more expansive and includes information about how you use applications, which features you interact with, how you navigate the operating system interface, and what content you engage with through Microsoft services. Activity. History is a related but distinct feature that stores a record of your recent activities. Documents you have opened, websites you have visited in Microsoft Edge, applications you have used, locally on your device, and if you choose to enable synchronization, on Microsoft's cloud servers. This history powers the Windows Timeline feature and integrates with Cortana and other Windows services that attempt to surface relevant content based on your recent activity. The recall feature represents the most ambitious and most controversial expression of this philosophy. Announced in 2024 as a flagship capability of Microsoft's Copilot Plus PC initiative, Recall was designed to take periodic screenshots of everything happening on your screen, every application, every document, every website, every conversation, and process those screenshots using on-device AI to create a searchable timeline of your complete computing history. The stated goal was to allow users to retrieve anything they had previously seen on their computer using natural language queries, effectively giving the operating system a photographic memory. Recall was designed to process data locally on the device using the neural processing unit present in Copilot Plus hardware, rather than transmitting screenshots to Microsoft's cloud. This architectural decision was significant and important to acknowledge. Microsoft's design intention was explicitly for this sensitive data to remain on the device. However, the security and privacy implications of creating a comprehensive, searchable record of everything displayed on a computer screen generated immediate and intense scrutiny from security researchers, privacy advocates, and the general public. The concerns surrounding these features range from the specific and technically grounded to the broader and more philosophical, and both categories deserve serious examination. The advertising ID concern is concrete and verifiable. Users who have not actively investigated their Windows 11 privacy settings are by default participating in Microsoft's advertising ecosystem through this identifier. For users who object to being targeted by behaviorally informed advertising, the existence of this identifier, enabled by default, generating a persistent profile across their device usage, is a substantive privacy concern rather than a theoretical one. The fact that the identifier can be disabled does not eliminate the concern that it exists and is active without most users' conscious knowledge. The telemetry concern involves both the practical and the principled. On the practical level, diagnostic data collection represents a background process that consumes system resources, network bandwidth, and to a minor extent, processing overhead. On older or lower specification hardware, these background processes can contribute to performance degradation that users experience as general sluggishness without understanding its source. On the principled level, the question of what data Microsoft actually collects under the optional diagnostic tier and how that data is stored, protected, and potentially used beyond its stated diagnostic purpose is one that independent researchers have found genuinely difficult to answer with complete precision. Microsoft publishes documentation about its data collection practices, and that documentation is more detailed than many technology companies provide. But the gap between the documented description and a fully auditable, independently verifiable accounting of what data leaves a Windows machine and what happens to it remains real. The recall feature generated perhaps the most intense and focused privacy response of any Windows feature in recent memory. Security researchers pointed out that a comprehensive, searchable screenshot timeline of a user's computing activity, even when stored locally on the device, represents an extraordinarily attractive target for malicious software. Any attacker who gains access to a device running recall does not need to monitor the victim's future activity. They have access to a complete historical record of everything the victim has done on that computer. Researchers demonstrated during the preview period before Recall's planned launch that the local database storing Recall's screenshots and associated metadata was accessible to other applications running under the user's account, creating a straightforward path for malware to exfiltrate the entire history. Users who proceed through the Windows 11 setup process without carefully examining each configuration option will emerge on the other side with an advertising ID active, optional diagnostic data collection enabled, and activity history configured. The architecture of default consent, where the system is configured toward data collection unless the user takes deliberate steps to configure it otherwise, is itself the subject of significant regulatory attention in privacy-conscious jurisdictions. Speculation has, in some online communities, extended beyond what the evidence supports. Claims that Windows is continuously recording microphone audio, that Recall transmits screenshots to Microsoft's servers in real time, or that telemetry data is being sold to third-party data brokers are not supported by Microsoft's documented practices or by independent technical research. Including these claims in a serious analysis would misrepresent the situation. The verified concerns are substantial enough without embellishment. Microsoft's position on these features is coherent, commercially motivated, and not without genuine merit. And understanding it honestly is essential to evaluating the trade-offs involved. The advertising ID exists because Microsoft operates advertising-supported services, and because application developers building for the Windows ecosystem need a mechanism to deliver relevant advertising to users who choose to use free ad-supported applications. The alternative, applications that do not have access to any personalization signals and therefore serve entirely random advertising, is not obviously superior from a user experience perspective. Advertising that is relevant to your interests while carrying its own implications is at least less disruptive than advertising that bears no relationship to anything you care about. Microsoft's argument is that the advertising ID enables a model of free application availability that users benefit from, and that the privacy settings it provides give users meaningful control over how that identifier functions. The telemetry system, from Microsoft's perspective, is the foundation of its ability to diagnose and resolve issues affecting Windows stability and performance at scale. Windows runs on an extraordinary diversity of hardware configurations, millions of unique combinations of processors, memory, storage, graphics, and peripheral devices. No testing environment can anticipate every compatibility issue that will emerge in real-world deployment. The diagnostic data that Windows machines transmit to Microsoft allows the company to identify stability issues, incompatible driver combinations, and performance problems that would be invisible without that data stream. The cumulative result of that data collection is, in Microsoft's framing, a more stable and better performing operating system for all users. This argument is technically sound. Large-scale telemetry genuinely does improve software quality in ways that are difficult to achieve through traditional testing alone. The question is not whether the telemetry produces benefits. It does, but whether the scope of optional data collection is proportionate to those benefits, and whether users are given adequate information and control to make genuinely informed choices about their participation. Recall was conceived as an attempt to solve a real and widely experienced problem: the difficulty of finding things you know you saw on your computer but cannot locate through conventional search. The experience of knowing you read a document, visited a web page, or had a conversation, but being unable to retrieve it through file search or browser history is frustratingly common. Recall's vision was an operating system that remembers everything you have done in the same way you might wish your own memory worked. The productivity potential of that capability for researchers, writers, analysts, and professionals who work with large volumes of information is genuinely significant. Microsoft's decision to redesign Recall as an opt-in feature and to implement additional security protections demonstrated that the company was responsive to the security concerns that researchers raised. The revised implementation is meaningfully safer than the originally announced version. Microsoft's framing is that Recall, properly implemented and properly secured, represents the future of productive computing, an AI-assisted operating system that extends the user's cognitive capabilities rather than simply storing files and running applications. The honest answer to this question is that it depends on who you are, how you use your computer, and what you value most in your computing environment. For users whose computers handle sensitive personal or professional information, legal documents, medical records, financial data, confidential communications, the case for disabling or minimizing these features is substantive. The advertising ID should be disabled. Optional diagnostic data collection should be set to required only. Activity. History synchronization should be turned off. If Recall is available on your hardware and has been enabled, the security surface it creates, a comprehensive, searchable record of everything on your screen, represents a risk that is disproportionate to the productivity benefit for most users in sensitive professional contexts. Disabling the advertising ID is straightforward. In Windows 11, navigating to Settings, then Privacy and Security, then General, reveals a toggle labeled Let Apps Show Me Personalized Ads by Using My Advertising ID. Turning this off disables the identifier for advertising purposes. The process takes approximately 30 seconds and has no meaningful impact on the performance or functionality of the operating system. Adjusting diagnostic data settings requires navigating to Settings, then Privacy and Security, then Diagnostics and Feedback. Setting the diagnostic data level to Required sends only the baseline hardware and stability information Microsoft uses for system diagnostics. Disabling the option to improve inking and typing does not affect core functionality. Disabling the option to send optional diagnostic data reduces the behavioral data Microsoft collects about how you use the operating system. Disabling activity. History involves navigating to Settings, then Privacy and Security, then Activity History, and unchecking the option to store activity history on the device and the option to send activity history to Microsoft. This disables the local and cloud-based activity timeline without removing any core Windows functionality. For users who value the personalization benefits these features provide, relevant recommendations in Windows Search, consistent experience across devices through activity synchronization, AI-assisted productivity through Recall, keeping some or all of these features enabled may be a reasonable choice. The personalization benefits are real, even if the privacy trade-offs are also real. Users who are comfortable with Microsoft's data practices, who read and accept the privacy documentation, and who find genuine value in the features enabled by this data collection have every basis for making that choice deliberately. For everyday users who have never examined these settings, the most important outcome is not any specific configuration decision, but the act of examining the settings consciously and making an active choice rather than accepting defaults without awareness. The Windows 11 privacy settings are more accessible and more granular than many users realize. Spending 15 minutes reviewing them is a worthwhile investment, regardless of what you ultimately decide to configure. The features described in this discussion are not isolated quirks of Windows 11. They are specific expressions of a much larger and more consequential shift in what an operating system is, what it does, and whose interests it primarily serves. For most of computing history, the operating system was a neutral platform. It managed hardware resources, ran applications, and stored files. It did not observe your behavior. It did not generate identifiers for advertising networks. It did not take screenshots of your screen. It did not send usage data to a remote server. It was a tool that served the person using it without maintaining any ongoing relationship with the company that made it. That model of the operating system is being replaced, not entirely and not immediately, but systematically and with commercial purpose, by a model in which the operating system is a connected platform that maintains a continuous relationship between the user and the software provider. In this new model, the operating system generates data about how it is used. It delivers advertising. It integrates cloud services. It extends AI capabilities that require behavioral data to function effectively. It evolves continuously through updates rather than existing as a static product. This is not unique to Microsoft. Apple's macOS and iOS collect diagnostic data, deliver personalized recommendations through Siri, and integrate deeply with Apple's cloud services. Google's Chrome OS is architecturally cloud-first by design. The direction of travel across the entire industry is toward operating systems that know more about their users, do more on their behalf, and maintain deeper connections to the infrastructure of the companies that build them. The regulatory environment is responding to this shift. The European Union's General Data Protection Regulation has imposed requirements on how technology companies collect and process personal data. And those requirements have produced changes in how companies like Microsoft present their privacy settings in European markets. The ongoing development of digital markets regulation in multiple jurisdictions reflects policymakers' recognition that the data practices of large technology platforms require oversight that market competition alone does not provide. The question of user autonomy is ultimately the most significant dimension of this discussion. Modern computing offers extraordinary capability. AI assistance that was the province of science fiction a decade ago, seamless synchronization across devices, services that anticipate needs before they are explicitly expressed. These capabilities are not delivered without cost. The cost is a degree of transparency about your behavior, your preferences, your activity, to the platforms that provide them. Whether that trade is acceptable depends on values that are genuinely personal. Your assessment of how the data will be used, your trust in the company holding it, your assessment of the security risks, and your philosophical position on the relationship between convenience and privacy. No one else can make that calculation for you. What this discussion can do, and what it has attempted to do, is ensure that the calculation is made consciously, with accurate information, rather than by default. The features examined in this discussion, an advertising identifier, a diagnostic data pipeline, an AI-powered screenshot timeline, may seem small in isolation. Settings buried in menus most users never open, background processes that generate no visible output, options presented during setup and forgotten immediately afterward. But small features reveal large directions. The advertising ID reveals a Windows ecosystem in which your computing behavior is a signal to be processed and monetized. The telemetry system reveals an operating system that maintains a continuous relationship with its maker rather than existing as a static product in your possession. Recall reveals a vision of computing in which the machine remembers everything, not to serve an external intelligence, but to extend your own, while simultaneously creating questions about security and control that the industry is still working to answer. Each of these features, examined honestly, points toward the same destination: an operating system that is increasingly aware of you, increasingly connected to cloud infrastructure, and increasingly difficult to separate from the commercial and data interests of the company that builds it. This is not presented as a condemnation of that direction. There are genuine benefits in that destination. AI assistance that understands your work context is more useful than AI assistance that does not. Personalization that reflects your actual preferences is more valuable than randomness. Continuous improvement enabled by aggregate diagnostic data produces a better product than isolated development without user feedback. But the most important changes in operating systems are rarely the ones announced at press conferences or featured in advertisements. They are the ones running quietly in the background, generating identifiers, transmitting data, taking screenshots, while you are focused on the work you sat down to do. Knowing what those changes are and making a deliberate choice about them is the difference between using your computer and being used by it. Because the question that defines the next decade of personal computing is not whether your machine will become more helpful. It is whether you will be able to tell the difference between helpful and simply watching.